Yes, thank you. Can you see me? Can you see the presentation? Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
works perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, it may have helped me, my judo training and judo, something that I have, mostly when dealing with people, honestly, more than MTs. As you already said, nothing is moving, okay. Our home company is Aglatech 14. We are based in Milan, in Italy. We are an LSP with a great experience in translating mainly patents. That's our core business. Legal text and life science. We are also ISO. We also have ISO certification in the 17100 and 18587, which, as you may know, are the ISO for language services and for post-editing. And then at the beginning of this year, our second company, so our child, let's say, was born, Orbital 14. That is our tech department moving to a different company to provide technological solution, including machine translation. In Aglatech, we already had some machine translation experience. In particular, we had our own trained engines, which we did not train ourselves, to be honest. We have an outside provider. We gave them all the materials that we already have, all the data, our translation memories, our term bases, and we trained 3 engines on patent material. And then after a couple of years working only with trained engines and only in patents, we decided that we needed some more versatile solution, and we decided to find some kind of generic engine that we could use in all other kind of domains, different from patents or different language combinations. So we decided to use online providers in the pro versions. As it was already mentioned before, we had some security concern, data protection concerns, so we decided to only use pro version of any kind of machine translation and engines that are offered online. To integrate generic engines, trained engines before that, but generic engines in particular, we decided to test the engines. And of course, we had some tests regarding quality, but mainly we focused on productivity, which is a little different from what we saw before, in the sense that our reasoning was that the machine translation needs to be an advantage both for the LSP and for the translators or post editors in this case, in terms both of time and money. Money, rates needed to be rediscussed, but also time, it was really important. This was mentioned also before. Machine translation needs to be a tool for the translators, and it needs to make them save time while translating. To do this kind of test, we tried to reproduce as much as possible the working environment that the post editors will find within Aglatech. Of course, we use cat tools, as most LSPs nowadays, and to integrate the machine translation, we do use cat tool connectors. So all the tests were designed to be run in a cat tool environment. In particular, since most of our post editors use Trados, we designed the test to be carried out within Trados with a plugin that is called Qualitivity, that basically tracks every keystroke, but mostly it tracks the time that the translator spends on each segment. What Qualitivity spits out whenever it is done, it's this. So it's a lot of data that can be very useful for a lot of different application whenever analyzing productivity or quality or anything that we want to analyze within those particular projects. But for the test that I'm going to show you, what we then did is filter out all the data that we have and filter it out so that we had, the name of the project, mainly the segment ID, so the number of the segment, and the time that the translator spent on that particular segment. It is also possible, sorry, to get the translation post-edit distance and many other kinds of quality indications, but for this particular test, we disregarded that part. To be able to analyze every kind of possible language combination or domain, we devised two kinds of tests. The first one is the one that we call lab test, lab productivity test. Lab tests are, as the name says, not real. They are not carried out in normal translating conditions. In particular, regarding cat tools, they don't get TMs, they don't get term bases, and the qualitativity plugin is always active. As regarding rates, they are paid for a fixed time to complete. So for instance, they are paid X amount of euros for 1 or 2 hours work. And they are not dependent on the word on the word count of each text. So the payment is decided mainly on the fact that they are gonna be spending 2 hours. The idea was that if in 2 hours or 3 hours, depending on the text, they were not done, they could just leave it incomplete, because the data that we gather would still be interesting as they are. The texts were created ad hoc, so it was a combination of pieces of texts that contained interesting characteristics or particular features that needed to be tested, and it was about 3,000 to 4,000 words, depending on language combination or whatever I could get my hands on. And the post editors that we chose, they all worked on the same text. They were at least 3, so that we could have an average of their velocity. They all had experience in post editing. They were all subject matter expert. In particular, they were all, in this case, patent subject matter experts, and they were all tech savvy. So they had to know how to use Trados, and they had to be able to set up qualitativity on their own, of course, with our help. So we did give them a guide or guidelines so that they could do anything that we wanted, but after a while they needed to know how to tackle minor technical issues. Why we set up this kind of tests? Thinking ahead, so the clients are not asking, they were not asking for that kind of post editing yet, but they might. So for instance, new language combinations or new domains. Again, new domain, so that we did not get enough post-editing orders in that particular domain to come up with a test on actual texts. So we had to create them. There were shorter deadlines, so the test needed to be carried out very quickly. So we could just put together the text and ask our post-editors to post-edit it very quickly. And or we wanted to focus in on particular characteristic to be tested. So for instance, terminology, or in the case of the cat tool integration, also the tags that were mentioned before, or I don't know, very long sentences. For instance, we did this one test where we chose phrases that were at least 4 to 6 lines long. So very long sentences that are actually quite common in patents. These are the main reasons that you would use a lab test to test a new translation engine. An example of this kind of test would be this one. So we had a generic engine to be tested. We had 3 post editors working on that, and each post editor would get 4 hours work. After 4 hours, if the post editing was not done, they were asked to just leave it at that and send us whatever they had gathered up until that moment. So it was a total of 12 hours of testing. And the text had about 3,000 or 3,600 words. Each post editor would work on the same text, which was divided between half of it was done in human translation and half of it was done in machine translation, so in post editing, so that then we would have a comparison between their actual speed in human translation and the actual speed in post editing. This is the results that we obtained. So about here you can see word per hour. This is the way that we calculated it, and we have about 606 words per hour when human translating. That's kind of doubled when using machine translation up until 12,020. Of course, this was just the in between the average of 3 people, so it's not completely indicative of the actual speed that you could get when post editing this into a working environment, but it gives you a good indication that machine translation is actually useful. So the productivity difference between machine translation and human translation in this case was more than 100%. But of course, then we would have to look at the each translator. And we have, as you see, the first translator had a productivity difference, machine translation to human translation, of plus 90%. The second one would be 97% increase. And the last one had a 126% increase. So in this case, what we did was consider that this last one, the 126% increase, was an outlier. And we considered that this machine translation in this case was about 90%, had about a 90% increase in productivity for the translators. I would like to point out that we do not use this particular tests to get to our rate, to change our rates. This is only to understand whether the machine translation is good enough to be used within production. So if it gives an actual advantage to both sides, so both to us, which I mean, we can actually deliver faster, and to our translators that would have this productivity increase, so they can actually translate more at the end of the day. The second kind of test that we have is a production test. The production test is completely real, or almost completely real. There are tests done in normal translating conditions on normal text. So on the CAT tool side, they have translation memories. They have their own main translation memories and project translation memory, depending on the project. They have term bases, and the only difference between the test set and the setting of a normal translation would be that the qualitativity plugin is active, or should always be active, so that I can get the data that I need. The time to complete, of course, is according to the client deadline, so it depends when the clients want the translation back, and it is paid as usual per word. It is actually paid per human translation word, because this is, if you remember, this is a test that we use to understand whether the machine translation can be used. So it wouldn't be fair to start using machine translator rate from the start, considering that we don't know if there is going to be a productivity increase or not. So we use human translation word rate for the tests. The texts for the tests are actual production texts, so they are projects that are given from the clients. They can be any number of words, considering that whatever comes our way we use for the tests. And we involve an extra review steps to assure that the quality is maintained even when using a new machine translation. So the post editors are not, in that particular case, used to using that output. And to assure quality, we go through an extra review. The post editors that we use, we consider the same criteria to choose them. So they will work on different texts. So they need to be at least 3 translators involved in the production tests. So at least 3 people working with the Qualitativity plugin active for the X amount of projects. They need to have experience in post editing. They need to be subject matter expert in patents. In this case, again, tech savvy. They need to know how to use Trados and solve minor issues again. And one more criteria in this case would be rate. Of course, we need to not lose too much money whenever we try to test machine translation in this way. Why we use the production test and not the lab test in this case would be to respond to a client requirement. So clients would come to us asking for post editing in new domains or new language combinations, and we need to test that on the flight the machine translation to understand whether it's good enough to be then used in all the following projects. It gives an accurate representation of how machine translation is going to influence the working of post editors. And it gives a broader spectrum on all the possible cases or use cases that we could get. And of course, there's budget savings because we are not paying actually paying extra for tests, but we are paying the usual rate. So those paying should have been given anyway. The project had to be delivered anyway, so people needed to be paid in any case. A quick example of this kind of test. In this case, we had different subject matters involved for a lot of orders, so a total of 12 orders that were involved in this test for a total sum of about 90,000 words with 6 post editors involved. And in this case, we tested 3 engines. One generic engine that were then compared to human translation, human translation productivity, and 2 generic engines, trained engines productivity as well. This is what came out from test. So generic engine would have about 1,100 words, and the trained engine had 1,194 words per hour. We consider in this case to have about 600 words human translation, if I remember correctly. So there was an increase in both cases, so both with the generic engine and the trained engine. But in this case, trained engine, our own trained engine, so trained with our material, very in domain specific, performed better than the generic engine. The difference between the generic engine and the trained engine is actually a -7% here. The difference between the trained engine and the human translation is about 59%. So all the post editors involved were about half rate faster with the trained engine than in human translation, and a little lower for the generic engine, so the 47% increase in productivity. In both cases, we would consider these trained engines or generic engines good enough to be used in production because they both gave a good productivity increase. But in any case, trained engine in this case showed a better productivity, so they showed that if possible in this particular domain, we should use our own trained engines instead of the generic one that we decided to test. And here I would end my talk.